And then this other layer came in on top of that, which is this activist part, which he has taken from an idea to a national campaign to raise awareness of opioid addiction and the terrible, terrible devastation that it's causing, to raise awareness of the companies that are making huge amounts of money from this awful drug, which has, it's like so many things, it's a matter of degree. There are ways in which the drug is helpful, but the ease with which it becomes something that is so addictive and creates so much havoc and misery and death, and so much profit for the manufacturers and the whole chain of distribution, is staggering. And I've been aware of that for a number of years. And I'm totally looking forward to hearing Domenic talk to us about this. He's going to be talking about his art and how he became an artist, and the wonderful command he has of the artwork. The pieces are beautiful and beautifully crafted, in addition to the power of their meaning. So, and then he'll be talking about the activist part. So, Domenic Esposito.
Well, thank you, Ellie. That was an incredible introduction, and thank you. Before I start, I want to thank Rolando, first of all, for being such a great friend. I mean, we've only known each other for a few years, and I feel like I've known him all my life. And you know, when we started speaking, you know, kind of midsummer about this exhibit, and you know, I sort of had kind of a working model of some of the work, and for him to have the faith in me to kind of deliver on it, you know, not, you know, you know, we'll talk about the opioid spoon project and the activism as well, but that part of it has always been, you know, it's funny, like people always introduce me, you know, sometimes by my name, but a lot of times they just introduce me as the spoon guy. So this was first, you know, my first real, you know, I'd done a lot of art, but this was the first time I really kind of tried to move from one project to another one that was just as important and had a lot to do with the opioid crisis in this country, and I'll get into that more specifically. So thank you all for being here. So I'm an artist and activist, and the activism is something, you know, as Ellie just pointed out, it's not something I signed up for, it's something that sort of happened kind of organically about 3.5 years ago when I dropped that first spoon in front of Purdue Pharmaceutical in Stamford, Connecticut. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time really kind of talking about the art, how I think about it, and then I'm going to show you a little bit of a video, some of them time-lapse. I promise they're going to be short, plus it'll be kind of a break from hearing my voice. And then we'll sort of talk about the activism and the meaning behind the mental health and some of my other projects. So I've always wanted my art to be, kind of create this visceral disturbance in the soul, if you will. And I know that sort of, you know, I think a lot of artists want that as well. And I think for me, it was sort of, how do I achieve that, you know, given I'm a sculptor, right? And so that kind of led me to creating these pieces that were both two-dimensional and three-dimensional, right? So I wanted someone who's looking at the art, or the viewer, to really feel kind of captivated, maybe by the three-dimensionality of it. And this was something I really kind of fell in love with, kind of reading about, you know, Renaissance art and some of the artists back, you know, 500 or 600 years ago, and bas-relief. So bas-relief, you know, and I know probably a lot of you know what it is, but it's basically a way of, that was done, you know, even pre-Renaissance, to show three-dimensionality in bronze, right? It sort of had this flat piece of bronze metal with these sculptures, very thin, coming out of it. And the way that it tricked you into thinking that there was an illusion, was this sort of perspective. So it was the first time we actually started seeing perspective in art, right? And guys like Brunelleschi and Gilberti and things like that. But in the very simple terms, what they were using that for was to tell a story, right? And you're like, well, how can you do that with art? Because a lot of, and it really even simplified even more, people didn't read, didn't know how to read back then, a lot of them. And so they had, the church wanted people to go to church, or if it was, Notre Dame, if you look at the Doors or the baptistry, you'll see the story, right? And so you didn't need to know how to read to be able to see the story, right? And to acknowledge it. And that's, in some sense, what led me to create this, because I wanted to tell a story, right? And that's what some of my work, I hope, kind of achieves. And it is a story that's painful, right, for a lot of us out there dealing with substance use disorder, mental health. But it needs to be told. It's I think we, as humans, sometimes we walk away from the painful part of our lives, and we always want to be happy. And I think sometimes we just need to live in the moment and live in whether it's grief and pain and something like that. And it's okay, right? We don't need to constantly feel joy and happiness, right? Pain is, and not feeling great every day is just part of being who we are. And I think at times we get pushed societal pressures to feel like we need to. Anyways, I don't want to get into the philosophical part of all of this. So what I'm going to do is Matt's going to play some videos, and I'm going to try to talk through some of them so that at least the first one, and then you'll see. So I'm going to stand over here so I'm not blocking. So a lot of it starts with photography. So my daughter, Marissa, she's 17, so she's a sample. I get her to dress in a hoodie and take tons of photos of her. These are just a few, and so these are the source photos, if you will, right? That's how I create. And then I create these mannequins, and this mannequin's basically made out of foam, and you're using a lot of wire and whatever you can find to sort of create this half structure. And that's the hoodie. Then you come back and see how it fits. And then then you're putting the hoodie. There's all staples and everything else, kind of holding it all in place. And there's 5 or 6 layers of starch and different chemicals to hold it in place. And there you have it in place. And then basically from there, once it's hardened and you really have, and it takes months for it to really kind of harden, and clay work to sort of work on some of the undercuts that develop. And the undercuts are bad for sculpting because that gets stuck. And so that's a silicone rubber that you put on there. Then it's a very thin rubber that allows you to penetrate and really get the detail in the clothing. And this is basically the mother mold. So it's a 3-piece mold that gets cast. So that's what the rubber looks like once you kind of pull it away from the mother mold. That all gets filled with wax, and that's the cast bronze. That's what cast bronze looks like when it comes out of the foundry. So this is us putting the patina on with different acids, and then washing it down, and then eventually putting a polish on it. And that's the piece that's back there. That's the saleable, and then this is with the oil background. So that's 3 months of work you got to see in in a minute. So we do have some. We want to do the YouTube, and we'll do some kind of more time lapse videos that are. Yeah, that one. Yep. It should open up, I hope. So this is the smaller sculpture. And eventually. I don't know if we should restart it, Matt. I'm not. Just worked too. Oh, there we go. All right, it's fine. So this is just the work in. You make a maquette really out of wire, and then you just keep applying clay until you add more and more detail and iteration. And again, my daughter was the source photos for this work. As you can see, like each photo, you get a little more and more detail. It's a very slow process. And then this is just a really quick time lapse of us pouring silicone rubber on the. You sort of have to do it in two people because it dries so quick, and you have to get all of the rubber into all those little crevices and the face and. So I think we did 3 coats, and it had a total of 5 coats. And each coat gets thicker and thicker.
Does each coat have to dry?
Yeah, there's a drying time. It's usually about an hour between each coat. Yeah. So that was like 3 hours worth of work in 45 seconds. So that's it for the videos. Oh yeah, that's. Is bright. So maybe now I'll talk a little bit about the sort of the meaning why the hoodie, and then I'll talk a little bit about the activism and the Opioid Spoon Project and why I got involved in that. So the name of the exhibit is called Blank Slate, and obviously they're hoodies, and people always ask me why is a hoodie, and the hoodie to me is yes, it's a piece of clothing, but it's a piece of clothing that's been around and used for years and years, right? You look at, Rocky, and even the Franciscan monks wore hoodies, and so I've always been fascinated by it because it's been a piece of clothing that's been around forever, and it also, in the last 15, 20 years has been used by different social economic status, right? It's almost kind of irrelevant, right? You can be a CEO, you could be inner city. It's just this weird fashion clothing that has really eclipsed, a certain standard and a certain person. And it's really a language at the end of the day. It's a language of, clothing is a language of how we feel, and how we wear it is how we feel. And it for me, it was always something that I saw whether it was my kids, my brother's really the inspiration why I got into the fighting opioid crisis, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And I always felt like I would see him or someone, or my kids or someone on the street, and wearing their hoodie down, and it always felt like, yes, there's something wrong. They weren't feeling great, right? And it's this sense of, whether it was mental health issues or substance use disorder, it was a way for them to say, like, leave me alone, right? And to hide, right? And I even saw it in myself, too. I wear hoodies all the time. In fact, I was going to come tonight with a hoodie on. But it is a way for us to say, I don't want to be left alone, right? And it also speaks to the whole issue around nature versus nurture, right? The reason why it's called Blank Slate is, are we victims of our environment, or is this genetic, right? In terms of like whether, what drives us to mental health issues, right? Or it doesn't even have to be mental health issues. What makes us who we are, right? Is it our environment, or is it genetic? And I think there's an argument to be made for the two of them. This is like an age-old argument. That's the whole tabula rasa discussion around that. And so the work kind of explores the environment around us really being the reason for who we are. And I always thought that, like, this hoodie was just a powerful way of saying that. And that's really it. It's really kind of telling this story. And the natural progression for this work was really brought out by the work I had done on the Opioid Spoon Project, which is a nonprofit. It's been around for 3.5 years, and we've done not just Purdue Pharmaceutical, and I've dropped these spoons in front of the FDA, which is there, Johnson & Johnson, and other pharmaceutical companies. We also took a spoon that was blank and had taken it to 15 cities, 10 states, where families that have lost loved ones sign this spoon, and I've met a lot of families that have unfortunately lost someone to the opioid crisis. And that, what really started off as this project because of my brother and this sense of hopelessness. My brother's still alive, but he's not actually doing that well right now. And he was the inspiration for it because the sense of hopelessness, how do we get government action here? How do we get change in legislation and call attention to it as well, really raising awareness of the opioid crisis. I know we all kind of know about it, but there really isn't a lot of help out there. It really is everyone sort of fend for themselves. There's a lot of community effort, which if we didn't have the community effort, I think the death rates would be even higher. It was a call to action, not just for the government, but for also pointing fingers at the pharmaceutical companies that have made billions and billions of dollars by selling these legally in this country and creating an addiction crisis over the last 25 years. And I think we're starting to see the headlines and the lawsuits, but it's still early days. Anyways, that's sort of like the activism component, the art component. I can sort of talk about it, and I don't want to talk forever, so I'm going to maybe pass it on to Ali or Rolando, and we can take questions. I do want to make it as interactive as possible. So,
I think Ali has a couple of questions
Yeah.
for you, Dom.
I always have questions.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back earlier
Okay.
and ask you how I know you had a career in finance,
That's right.
and you transitioned to being an artist. How did that happen?
It was really organic. And it's funny, my two worlds, I was in finance up until about 7 years ago. And when I meet people who were my former colleagues in finance and they see my work, and we had one gentleman here who was my old colleague, it's almost like they don't believe I'm the same person. And then the people in the art world, they're like, well, really? You were in finance? And I think it's also, what I always say to people is I think as a society, we tend to put people in boxes, and I think that's wrong, because if you look back at, not to dwell on the Renaissance time, and I'll answer your question more directly, but you look back at the Renaissance, people were engineers, they were artists, they were, generals, who just did a bunch of different things, and I think now we tend to specialize and put people in boxes, whereas even within finance, I always loved art. I did a lot of art classes when I was, in undergrad, and photography and things like that. And I've always had art around with my kids. We've always, painted. But the reason how I got into it was really a welding class. I took a welding class 7 years ago, and I absolutely fell in love with it. Just the sense of heat and molding metal, and it was, and I just really, so all of a sudden, I take the class, and I buy my first welding machine, then I buy hydraulic presses and everything else that kind of slowly, just start making work, and people start liking, and I did a few commissions early on, and it really just started. And I think if I were to sort of point at how I achieved it, and I think it was, yes, it was the creativity, because I think I've always, people have some extent creativity, but it was also a lot of work, right? And I think as an artist, we forget how much work, and I always love praising artists because I know how much work they put into what they're doing, and it is a very time-consuming, it's a labor of love, and that's what it was for me. It was just I'm gonna do this, and so 6 years ago, I really decided to go in full time. This is all I'm going to do. I'm not going to do anything else. So it's that. I don't know if that answers.
And you were talking about the welding class, but when I look at the painting on that wall,
Yeah.
I see some very fine painting.
Thank you. Because that was my first. I mean, and it was, I had done and this is the other thing too with me, and I think a lot of us do this as artists, is you become methodical about like, I want to learn this, I want to learn that, and so I took a lot of, I don't have an art degree, but I probably do in terms of like, if you accumulate all of my classes I've taken, right? I mean, I've done, I did a 1-week marathon where it was some of the hardest work I did on charcoal painting, and we had a model there, like it was literally like 10 hours a day for the whole week. It was intense, and so, but things like that. I've taken classes at RISD at Mass College of Art, and finally enough to have the confidence to start doing this stuff 3 years ago, so the painting. So, yeah, thank you.
So those are 2 questions. I've got lots of questions, but I would like to hear from people in the audience.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm an artist also, and it's very important. Why you choose material? Why you choose bronze instead of just for the purity? Why you choose that kind of material? And why you decided to have a painting instead of a photograph on the back? Why
Yeah.
using these materials and not other? What is your inspiration? Is the process important or?
It's 2 things. One is the process, and I'm sort of very engineering focused. Like, these are my bronzes, but I also do a lot of fabrication work, where it's like, putting stuff together and figuring it out on CAD, and I've done that kind of work. But specifically this one, it was the inspiration for it, and I know that it's going to sound strange, but I read a book, a Da Vinci book, like 3 years ago, and in the book, I realized that he hated sculptors, right? He hated sculptors because for him, sculptors were a lesser art, right? Because with painting, you create the illusion, right, that it's 3-dimensional, right? Sculptors don't do that, right? You don't, and so, and then he goes into this whole thing. He was like, they were all dirty, they're filthy all the time. They're all, I can go to work covered, in my shirt and tie, and I'm a painter, and so for me it was like, oh, here, what am I doing, and so I thought about it, and I said, you know what, I'm going to create, and sculptures are really hard for people to buy, right? Because they take up personal space in your house, right? Versus a painting that's on the wall, you can look at it. So I said, you know what? I'm going to create the illusion that he thinks sculptors don't have, right, in a painting, and still give you the perspective. And that perspective really is back to some of the, the work I studied on Renaissance art, that I love that whole perspective look. And in fact, like if you look at that piece in particular, I took it even a step further, and it's very subtle, but if you look at that left shoulder, you can see it's a different patina than down to the bottom. So I tried to create the illusion of light, and my whole sense is like when I put this up, it was always supposed to be like a dark background, and it was supposed to be a spotlight on it, so you can actually see the patina difference between that top shoulder going down. So, because, effectively, well, it's with art, like all you're trying to do as a painter is create that illusion with light and shadow, chiaroscuro, so that's what I was trying to do with, and it was sort of just a, kind of like in your face, like I can do this, kind of thing. Sorry, I don't know if that answers it, but that's really kind of what went through my head.
I got a question for you. How important is aesthetic considerations? When you tackled the initial project, it was out of outrage.
Yeah.
Your brother was an addict. You were emotional. I've heard your story. And then you're going to produce a piece of artwork, and basically a protest piece. How much time do you think that you gave it? Did you study? Did you read? On how to present it where it would be considered fine art as well as protest art?
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of the thought process I went to. Sometimes I sit on these, as an artist, you sit on work for years before you actually create it, right? I've got, I'm always full of ideas. I just don't have the time to, to get them all executed, nor the money, because some of them are very expensive. But it was, for me, this, I thought about the spoon a year ahead of time, right? And I always felt, yes, we're talking about a utensil that was dirty, that was used for drugs. But I always thought that art, this is my sense with it, and other artists could, disagree, and we can argue all day long about this, but I feel like art should be aesthetically beautiful. Like, not all art has to, but like, at least I'm gonna do that, right? So even though I was creating the spoon, I still wanted it to be beautiful, right? And I think the reason why I did it so big was just for the sense of the guerrilla art component of it, right? You don't want it removed, and if I could, I would have made it, 20 feet instead of 10 feet. But that, exponentially, makes it difficult to make and to ship. So, in fact, like one of the artists that that I really kind of loved was, at the turn of the century, was Constantine Brancusi, and when he did mostly sculptures, and they're beautiful bronze sculptures, extremely polished. But not only the sculptures polished, but he would spend just as much time as on the bases, right? And the reason why he did that is because he hated when people would take his sculpture, buy it, right, and then just put it on a table. So, and in some sense, that's, I think, I'm more in that camp, right? That in terms of like art should have a fully executed component to it. Sorry, I don't know if that. Yeah.
What's next with the spoon displays? Where are you looking to display the spoon?
So the nonprofit, the Opioid Spoon Project, is an ongoing act. We're activists. Like, I have volunteers, and we just show up with the spoon, so we don't tell people what our next protest is. I get asked a lot by the media, where you're going to drop the spoon next, and you just don't know. So we actually have a spoon built. It's in my studio that's done. Because of COVID, we've had to slow down everything. But, we're hoping in the fall to be back with some activism. There's a laundry list of people who have benefited financially from the opioid crisis tremendously and have enabled the crisis to continue till this day. It's still happening. So.
You had mentioned that you were known as the spoon guy. Is Blank Slate your departure from being pigeonholed into a one-theme, one-hit wonder in the art world? Because this show fascinated me, only more so because it was a grand departure from what you were doing. And it's a big risk because constantly people keep calling you back for the Spoon Project. How do you make peace with it that pigeonhole may last forever?
Yeah, and I think that's okay. Like, that's just part of art. I always feel like, artists, we're our own worst kind of enemy at times, and art is up to the viewer to really kind of pay attention to what it is. I think I'm more in the camp of like, I'm going to do a lot of research on why what I'm making, why I'm making it, be thoughtful, and the rest is up to, everyone else if they like it or not. I think that's all I can do. It's really hard to. There's no shortcuts, and there's no way to muscle your way in. And I think, it's great, the media attention I got with the Opioid Spoon Project, but there's a lot more to me, and I think that's coming across with this work. And I hope so. I mean, so I don't know. So,
So do
yeah.
I.
Yeah, yeah.
Alan?
Hi, I just wanted to bring up the awareness that you actually exhibited this 800-pound opioid spoon at the Palm Beach Convention Center. I think it was the International Art Show, and I think it was funded by Hanley Foundation. I'm not sure how you got here. But ironically, this was at a time when we became aware that the Sackler family, Sackler-Purdue complex, had purchased a building on 6th Street here in West Palm Beach, Florida, and a group of people that are involved, in the Substance Awareness Coalition, did a demonstration. And the timing of that exhibition, as well as your presence,
Yeah.
and our appreciation for your participation in that project is astounding. So as a focal point, just looking at the scale and size of the spoon, is an attention getter. People that are, even though the opioid epidemic has taken over 400,000 lives, mostly young people, leaving parents without their children, can't imagine a greater loss, and grandparents raising their grandchildren. This vehicle is tremendous. I was very much impressed that we're taking it further into the overall mental health
Yeah.
field, having gone through the social distancing of COVID, and how that's impacted on so many families, also escalating the use of drugs, relapses, and an increased number of opioid-related deaths. So the alienation that I see with the hood, the posture of the guy bent over, screams of this kind of separate, insular. So I just wanted to bridge those two together.
Yeah, no, thank you. And
Tremendous,
I mean, and I sort of left out the whole loneliness and isolationism, which is really a big component of the work. And thank you, yeah.
no matter what the background is,
Yeah,
with the,
yeah.
thank you,
Dominic,
you.
I have a question. Can you talk about these three pieces?
Yeah, yeah.
They're not on, I didn't see them on your website. I haven't seen any
Yeah.
reference in.
They are like further down. So I made those like 2 years ago, before all the protests this year. And it's funny, like they've gotten into 2 juried shows. In fact, today they're in an online juried show, the New England Sculpture Association, which I was really happy to be part of because it's a very prestigious. Sorry for trying to be some modesty here, but anyways, and the piece is called "Can You Hear Me Now?" and there's a speaker component which we could play later on. We just shut it but anyways, so it's 100 years of protests in the United States and or around the world really, but it's the labor movement and the wartime peace movement in the 60s, labor movements in the 30s, and then the Me Too movement now, and it really, there's a quote that I heard when I started doing some of this activism work about politicians. Politicians love activists because we all burn out, and if you go to like Washington D.C., any weekend there's like 30 rallies happening, and it's sort of meditative for people to go there with their posters, and sometimes there's change, but a lot of times it's just people screaming and there's no change, right? And my point with this is like, yes, it's hard to not be hopeless at times, feel hopeless at times as an activist, but there are periods where things do happen, like the labor movement that we all, the child labor laws and all that stuff that happened in the 30s and 40s, the war and peace movement, and then the Me Too movement, and so there are big changes that happen, and we can't give up on activism. It's it's a First Amendment right, and then the speaker plays a 4-minute clip I gathered all this sound from the Library of Congress, so none of it is copywritten, so we didn't infringe on any copyrights, and it's just layered, and it's just all this screaming and yeah, well, close to it. So the 30s, so let's say 80 years of protesting. So
Progress in these areas is very, very slow.
yes,
And it's bringing issues to people's attention, and increasing numbers of people's attention, and suddenly there's a tipping point
Yeah.
where this has been complained about for 50 years, and now we're going to do something.
Yeah,
And we
yeah.
keep, those of us who were watching these, you know, and working in any way, get frustrated,
Yes.
get very frustrated. But also there is a point where enough of the population can be turned from passive to active,
That's right.
and you keep hoping to nudge it along.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly it. And if we all lose hope, then we're never going to have change. And so,
I was struck when I began to look at your website at the press this man has gotten. It is amazing. And what amazed me most was that it is national press, it is local press, and it is art press. He's been written about in Hyperallergenic and Art Forum and Artsy and on and on and
Yeah.
on, as well as in the New York Times and news reports on television, and it's just all over the place.
Yeah.
It's quite an achievement.
no, thank you. Yeah, it's been a lot of work, but it's also been, satisfaction that the media is on our side. And you'd be surprised, like, it's incredible. Like, I remember even so many people affected by the opioid crisis. And, I remember journalists calling me up, and they'd do the interview, and then, at the end of the interview, they're like, oh, my sister's, suffering from opioid crisis, and I really love your work. And it's like, you just click, it's an automatic, and it gives you goosebumps to hear that from people. And so, there's just, I can't even tell you how many people are out there that are know somebody who have just been part of this, and I think even the journalism as well. They really. I've met a lot of great people along this journey.
Does anyone else have anything? Comment, thought, reaction?
I'm just curious, what kind of a market is there for this work?
Good question.
Is it the corporate art, or are there funding agencies? The material you're using, this bronze, I get such a kick out of feeling the weight of the head of that guy that comes apart. It's heavy.
Yeah, yeah.
Heavy subject matter and heavy material. It's smooth. It has a tactile quality
Yeah.
to it that's extraordinary. The detail in the sneaker speaks volumes to me.
Yeah.
But what kind of a market? How do you survive on this?
Yeah, it's, we need more galleries like Rolando who can take take a punt on, this kind of stuff. And it's, I say it, but it's true. Like, it's true. It's a heavy subject matter, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of galleries who want to tackle subjects like this. I think it's also, art. We put a stamp on history. That's what artists do. I'm not talking about me, but I think, and I think all this stuff is happening right now. That there's also a lot of stigma around it. And you look at things like the HIV crisis and AIDS crisis, and a lot of that art that came out of there. It was years later that people started really kind of saying, I want this in a museum, and I want it there, because it was too fresh, it was too stigmatized still to be associated with it. And I think, this subject matter it's a heavy subject matter. It's not for everybody. You're not going to, I would love for people to put the hoodie on their living room, but, it's not, it's just a different, and maybe they will, but I don't know. But it's not for corporates either. They're all, want us to feel good, right? So they make money off of it, so.
That was one of my downfalls in this gallery. I show art that I find culturally relevant and well executed. Right here in the audience, I have a number of artists that produce work that needs to be seen. and their saleability is inconsequential to me. And if I need to pony up my own personal money to be able to provide the exhibition space, I have done so. I try, and I have yet to take money from grants or from funding organizations because I do not want to get my legs cut off from my decision making and have other people tell me what's relevant or not in culture. And this is a heavy show, as other exhibitions that we have shown. And I have been told, let me help you with this. And I have politely said I prefer to close the gallery than to be at the behest of someone else's editing. And yet it's been a pleasure to have his work here and to show it in its full context with liberty to talk about heroin addiction, to take a position on the Sackler family. A couple of months ago, we had an installation here where we talked about immigration. And this is a safe space where we can talk about everything. And I think the gallery setting allows for everybody to have a position and to once again bring back what was traditionally called a debate and to stand your ground on your position, whether I agree with it or not, and respectfully engage in a dialogue about it. That's what I've seen that's been missing quite a bit, that we have gone into this black and white, this is, or that, and we forgot that two conversations, whether they're living in your head or in the audience or on this table, can be valid and opposing. And I'm grateful that artists are producing work that challenges that and that makes you think. So sometimes saleability traditionally hasn't come until they're long gone and dead for about 100 or 200 years. And then maybe somebody will realize the value and the impact it had culturally.
Yes.
Going back on what you first said, you said you've been painting, or you went full-time to doing art 7 years ago?
6 years ago, yeah.
What was, I guess, the theme or in the beginning? So that was my first question. How did you start? What was, let's say, your first series of works? And then further, now in your career as 6 years have gone by, you're, as we're talking about this show, which is, like you said, it is somewhat heavy or like a triggering type of
Yeah.
content, which some people want to, I think, turn a blind eye to, pretend
Mm-hmm.
that it doesn't exist. And I'm happy to hear that somebody is doing this and taking on something that's not
Yeah.
like pleasant to the viewer or whatnot. And I think, as an artist myself too, sometimes I paint and I think I actually don't even want an opinion. I don't care if
Yeah.
somebody likes this, and I do it for almost for me.
Yeah.
It's very helpful and mentally it's therapeutic, and some interesting creations come out of that. So do you focus now more on, I guess, your own energy and your own love
Yeah.
versus the viewer's opinion?
It's kind of a loaded question. I think for me, it's, I focus, and I'll get back to the stuff I did before, but I've always tried to focus on the things that give me passion, like that really kind of, whether it's passion of anger or things that really I'm dealing with personally, like within my family, right, or friends. So it's always been a real, I think with art, I think it always should be some inner feeling, right? And whether that's demonstrated through painting or sculpture or ceramics or whatever it is, but it should have something, an imprint of how you feel, right? And things that matter to you, and we're all different in that sense. So I'll sit around and like there's things that, that bother me, right? When I did like my brain sculptures and I was like, well, why'd you do brains? I'm like, well, like I'm so sick of all these marketing companies and my kids and the social media and it's the drugs and the gambling, and I've had family, and so that for me was like, it was just a visceral response to it. How do I capture this in sculpture? So anyways, that's the way, I sort of go about thinking about things, and or even that piece. So when I started really kind of welding and fabricating, I was doing a lot of, which is going to sound strange, but I was doing a lot of Asian art. so a new focus on kind of, and not Asian, but Tori Gates. So Tori Gates for me was like this sense of, Tori Gates are like, the gates that you see, but I had made I've done a lot of those large, some of them 15 feet tall, and in very modern materials. And then also the meaning behind those was like, it was always like this meditative state for me, that it was so incredible that you go from, the reason why they have them is because you go from a stage of profanity to the spiritual world, right? And that could be in your garden, or it could be like, leaving and going out to fishing or whatever it is they did in those days. So I always loved that sort of meditative state of, crossing one to the other, right? And how we sometimes, Friday afternoon is this meditative state, oh, I finished the work week, now I got the weekend. So, I'd done a few commissions on those, and that was early on. And I did some pieces on eating disorder. So I had someone, I don't want to get into, it wasn't me, but it was someone very close to me. And then this, then really the activism and the spoon and everything else, which was about 4 years ago. So, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Is why those sculptures are so strong, the spoon is so strong, because the simplicity of the
Yeah.
capture the attention of everyone and take it out of the context and make you wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. And that has actually been something that's been really hard for me to simplify my work. In fact, like with that one there, the black and white, I was going to add color and do all this other stuff, and then once I finished the black and white, I was like, you know what, it's done. I love it like this. I don't want to take away from the sculpture. And so, like to your point, sometimes we, as artists, we're always adding too much layers, and sometimes it's better to just remove the layers and simplify your work and concentrate on the aesthetics rather than the amount of what's in there. So, thank you.
Earlier today.
Yes.
No.
Oh.
Go ahead.
So I noticed on some of your pictures, of course you have the hoodie, you have the sculpture, but what inspires the actual background? Because of color, you use a lot of color.
Yeah.
I see orange, I see green, and I'm big on colors.
Yeah, yeah.
Reads a lot, and you get a lot from a person's artwork just by the colors that they use. So was color like big?
Yeah. I put a lot of thought into the color, right? But not in a traditional sense, like, red represents this and green represents, for me it was like the red one there is called, with the red hoodie, with the darker hoodie is called the saleable, and I just wanted to show this sense of vulnerability, right? So that the red is like this passion, right? And the middle one is called duplicity, and I added the flowers and the blue sky and everything because I wanted, it's sort of this sense of like how we deal with mental health or how people are feeling is sometimes it's that sense of like, the face that we put on it is colorful and blue skies, right? But the clothing tells you there's something there that's not. Oh, so like an example, like you ask somebody how you're doing, they're like, "Oh, I'm okay," and you know things aren't okay, but you don't ask them anything else, right? Because you don't want to be, it's just human nature. Like we don't want to hear it, right? And so that's what that piece speaks to. In the green, for me, it's sort of like it's a dual sense of like being hidden, right? You don't see that person because he's like morphs into the background. But also, that green is called verdigris, so it's called feeling verdigris, and it back to like the nature versus nurture and our environment. That color traditionally you get on bronze if you leave your bronze outside untreated for like 20 years because it's got copper on it in the bronze. And so I accelerated that, so it's a sense of like, here's 20 years of history that's created who we are, right, rather than the genetics. So I don't know if that makes sense. So each one of them was thought out that way, and the summertime is like, everything's rosy and peachy because it's all summertime, and you got your what's the dress that gets worn in summer that's got the Lily Pulitzer. Yeah. So it's like everything's fine, but it's not, right? so it's kind of, that's how I think about my colors.
Earlier today, someone walked in, and he was looking at the piece, and he said, I'm waiting, he's looking at it, and he said, I'm waiting for it to continue the dialogue I'm having with it. And I go like this, okay, would you like to meet the artist? He's standing here. And when you approached him, he said, I don't want to hear from you. I want to hear from the painting.
Yeah.
How did you respond to that? Did you understand what he meant?
Yes. And I think that's been something like that's been tough, and I think it's tough for artists because we make things and we have our interpretation like why we make it. Like I just gave you that whole description of those, right? That kind of ruined what you thought about it. And I think as artists, sometimes we have to step back and say, okay, I made the art, let it be out there, let people interpret it the way they want, and not force it. So I think that's a great point, and I think it's been hard for me over the last couple of years to just let go and say, no, that's your view and that's right, versus.
Because he wanted to learn about you.
Yeah.
And his interpretation was, these are autobiographical. This is not necessarily thematic. And the artist is talking to me, as when I go to see a Gauguin, I walk into the painting and I live in that.
That's what he
world.
said, yeah, I remember.
And then he stated that he was invited into Unconditional. Have you heard people respond that way to other works that you have done?
I mean, I think, the spoon does that because it does create that visceral feeling, but not like that one, because that's, especially from far away, like you get that sense of like continuing in the painting as he described it. So, no, I mean, I think, that piece, it's sort of, I think, what I've really loved about it is just hearing all the different interpretations of it, which I think is great.
Why tackle bas-relief?
Yeah, I think I'm working on a bigger project as well, which is all bas-relief, and that's. But bas-relief to me was always, I don't know why, I just always fell in love with that type of how sculptures are made that way. It's like, you're still doing perspective, you're doing the stuff you do in paintings and the illusion, but you're doing it in a flat, semi-flat, and I've always just really loved it and intrigued with the beauty of it and the simplicity of trying to do it. So I think that's good. I don't want to we get to sample some beer now.
Okay.
I think this has been
Unless-
amazing.
Yeah,
And there are so many questions that I've had that someone else here asked.
yeah.
And because we've all got those questions, you
Yeah.
know, our minds are all trying to process it. Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you for being here. Thanks, Arad. Thank you.
We're going to take a few moments to mingle. We do have 3 or 4 different versions of our wonderful craft beer produced by civil society that they encouraged us to promote, and then the after party will be over there. For non-drinkers, we have wine, we have water and sodas.